The tunnel twisted endlessly, a maze of cold and silence that seemed to stretch into eternity. Morgan's team moved in tense, exhausted silence, the weight of Daniel's disappearance and the alien monstrosity pressing down on them like the ice itself. Their lights flickered and the faint hum from the monolith still lingered in the air, a ghostly reminder of what they had left behind. After what felt like hours, the narrow passage opened into another cavern, smaller and more contained. The team's headlamps revealed a hastily abandoned camp, the remnants of the missing scientists' last stand. Equipment was scattered across the frozen ground, overturned tents, half-melted heaters, and frost-rimed laptops. Everything was eerily intact, as if the occupants had vanished mid-action. Morgan stepped forward, his boots crunching on the ice. "Stay sharp. Whatever happened here didn't leave quietly." Carter knelt by a workstation, her breath fogging the air. She brushed frost from a laptop, her gloved fingers trembling as she powered it on. "It's dead," she said, her voice taut with frustration. "But the hard drive might still be intact." Greaves, meanwhile, examined the remains of what looked like a makeshift laboratory. Strange tools lay scattered among alien artifacts, the obsidian black objects similar to those they had seen earlier. One artifact, however, stood out, a spherical object with a texture that seemed to shift between metal and flesh as the light hit it. "This is wrong," Greaves muttered, his voice barely audible. "It's adapting. I think it's alive." "Leave it," Morgan ordered sharply. "We focus on finding answers." Carter managed to extract the hard drive from the laptop and connect it to a portable reader. The device flickered to life, displaying a series of journal entries from the lead scientist, Dr. Helena Marks. Carter read them aloud, her voice steady despite the mounting tension. The early logs detailed the team's excitement over their discovery of the monolith. Marks described it as a structure that defies all known understanding, its material unlike anything terrestrial. She theorized that it wasn't just a relic, but a living machine, powered by some kind of organic energy. Her tone brimmed with awe, even as she noted strange phenomena, hallucinations, distorted radio signals, and a growing sense of unease among her team. The later entries were frantic, the words typed in bursts of panic. "We activated something. It wasn't intentional. We were trying to decode the glyphs, and the monolith responded. The hum grew louder and the ice began to melt. Something emerged. At first it was small, just tendrils. But it grew. It feeds on the ice, absorbing it, transforming it. I think it's been dormant, frozen here for millennia. We've awakened it." Marks's final logs were interspersed with desperate warnings and fragmented observations. She described her team's bodies changing, their skin darkening and hardening, alien growths sprouting from their flesh. One by one, they succumbed, their humanity stripped away as the creature consumed them. The last entry ended abruptly. "It's not just a creature. It's a system, a biological engine designed to adapt, to propagate. We're all part of it now. If you find this, don't..." The log cut off mid-sentence, replaced by a burst of static. Carter looked up, her face pale. She knew what it was, and she knew it wasn't just going to stay down here. As the gravity of Mark's words sank in, a sound echoed through the cavern, a wet, slithering noise accompanied by faint, guttural clicks. The team froze, their lights darting toward the darkness beyond the camp. "It's here," Morgan whispered, gripping his ice axe. "We need to move. Now." But before they could act, the shadows shifted. Something massive and amorphous oozed into view, its surface a grotesque amalgamation of alien and human features. Faces, half-formed, frozen in expressions of agony, protruded from its flesh, their mouths moving soundlessly. Tendrils writhed from its core, glistening with a fluid that hissed as it dripped onto the ice. Carter screamed, stumbling back. Greaves stood paralyzed, his eyes locked on the creature. Morgan grabbed him by the shoulder and shook him hard. "Move! Don't let it touch you!" The team retreated toward the tunnel, but the creature moved faster than something of its size should have been able to. One of its tendrils lashed out, grazing Greaves's arm. He cried out, clutching at the wound as black veins spread rapidly beneath his skin. Morgan dragged him forward, ignoring the man's screams. "Carter, find us a way out." Carter fumbled with her scanner, her hands trembling. "This way," she shouted, pointing toward a narrow passage that branched off the main cavern. The team sprinted into the tunnel, the creature's guttural clicking growing louder behind them. The passage twisted and turned, narrowing to the point where they had to move single file. Morgan could hear Greaves' breathing growing ragged, his cries of pain turning into something inhuman. A wet, gurgling sound that sent chills down Morgan's spine. "We can't stop," Morgan barked, though his heart sank as Greaves fell to his knees, convulsing. Carter turned back, her eyes wide with horror. "He's changing," she whispered. Morgan saw it too. Greaves' body was warping, his skin bubbling as alien appendages sprouted from his back. His face twisted, his features collapsing into something unrecognizable. With a heavy heart, Morgan raised his axe. "Commander, no!" Carter shouted, but Morgan knew there was no other choice. The blow was swift and final, and Greaves' distorted body slumped to the ground. Morgan turned away, his jaw clenched, and motioned for Carter to keep moving. The tunnel eventually opened into another chamber, smaller and devoid of alien markings. The faint hum of the monolith was gone, replaced by the oppressive silence of the ice. Morgan leaned against the wall, catching his breath as Carter knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. "We're not getting out of here alive, are we?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Morgan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared into the darkness they had just fled. The creature was still out there, hunting them. And worse, Mark's warnings echoed in his mind. "It's not just a creature, it's a system." He looked at Carter, his resolve hardening. "We're going to make it out, and we're going to make sure this thing never leaves." But even as he said the words, a small, treacherous voice in his mind whispered otherwise. "The system is already awake. It's already spreading." The tunnels were collapsing. The first tremor had been subtle, a faint vibration underfoot that could be dismissed as the ice settling. But as the team scrambled through the labyrinth, it became clear that the ancient structure was destabilizing. The walls groaned like a dying beast, cracks splintering across their frozen surfaces as the creature pursued them. The alien hum that had once been a distant echo now roared in their ears, a relentless reminder of the living machine they had awakened. Morgan led the way, his breath coming in sharp bursts that misted in the frigid air. His hands gripped the ice axe so tightly, his knuckles ached, but he didn't dare loosen his hold. Behind him, Carter struggled to keep up, her steps faltering under the weight of exhaustion and fear. "We're almost there," Morgan shouted over the cacophony of cracking ice and distant clicks. It was a lie, and they both knew it. He had no idea if the surface was close, or if the labyrinth would stretch on forever, trapping them in its frozen embrace. But he had to keep moving. Stopping meant death, or worse. A deafening roar split the air, a sound that was both organic and mechanical, vibrating deep in their chests. Carter stumbled, clutching at her ears. "It's getting closer," she screamed, her voice tinged with despair. Morgan turned, grabbing her arm and pulling her forward. "Don't look back, just run." The creature was relentless, a monstrous amalgamation of tendrils and malformed bodies that oozed through the tunnel with impossible speed. Its bulk seemed to defy physics, folding and reshaping itself to fit the narrow passage. Faces, some human, others grotesquely alien, emerged from its surface, their mouths moving in silent screams. As they ran, the whispers returned, insidious and invasive. They weren't just sounds, they were thoughts, alien and incomprehensible, pressing against their minds like cold fingers. Morgan clenched his jaw, forcing the whispers out, but Carter faltered, her expression crumpling. "They're inside my head," she whimpered. "I can't. Focus," Morgan snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. "You're stronger than it. Keep moving." The tunnel opened into a massive chasm, a jagged wound in the ice that stretched into darkness below. A fragile bridge of ice spanned the gap, thin and translucent, barely wide enough for one person. The surface cracked under Morgan's boot as he tested it, and he swallowed hard. "We don't have a choice," he said, motioning for Carter to go first. "Stay low. Move fast." Carter hesitated, her gaze flicking back toward the tunnel they had just fled. The creature's clicking grew louder, its grotesque form visible in the distance, tendrils writhing as it surged forward. "Go!" Morgan barked. Carter nodded, dropping to her hands and knees as she crawled onto the fragile bridge. The ice groaned beneath her weight, but she pressed on, inch by agonizing inch. Morgan followed close behind, his every step calculated, his eyes fixed on the far side. Halfway across, the creature reached the edge of the chasm. It hesitated for a moment, its mass shifting as if assessing the bridge. Then it surged forward, tendrils slithering onto the fragile ice. "Faster!" Morgan shouted, urgency sharpening his tone. The bridge began to crack, spiderweb fractures spreading beneath them. Carter scrambled forward, her breaths coming in panicked gasps. She reached the other side just as the first chunk of ice gave way, sending shards plummeting into the abyss. Morgan wasn't so lucky. The ice beneath him buckled, and he threw himself forward, landing hard on the edge of the chasm. His axe clattered out of reach as his body dangled precariously, one hand gripping the icy ledge. Carter was there in an instant, her hands wrapping around his wrist. "I've got you!" she yelled, her voice trembling. Behind them, the creature hesitated again, its tendrils retracting as it studied the crumbling bridge. For a moment, it seemed to withdraw, as if it understood the risk. But then it lunged. Morgan felt the vibrations as the bridge collapsed entirely, the creature plunging into the chasm. Its bulk twisted and writhed as it fell, its alien screeches echoing through the void. For a brief, fleeting moment, silence returned. Carter pulled Morgan up, collapsing beside him on the icy floor. They lay there, gasping for air, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and cold. "Did we kill it?" Carter asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Morgan stared into the darkness of the chasm, his heart still pounding. "I don't think something like that can die." The final stretch to the surface was a blur, a desperate climb through collapsing tunnels and roaring wind. When they emerged into the blinding light of the Antarctic sun, it felt unreal, as though they had crossed into another world entirely. The sky was a pale, icy blue, and the cold air bit at their exposed skin. A helicopter was already waiting, its rotors slicing through the stillness. Rescue teams rushed toward them, their voices distant and muffled as Morgan and Carter stumbled forward. But the nightmare wasn't over. As they were loaded into the helicopter, Morgan noticed something on his hand. A small, dark patch of skin, pulsating faintly. He pulled his glove tighter, hiding it from view, but Carter caught the movement. Their eyes met, and understanding passed between them. "It's not over, is it?" she asked quietly. Morgan shook his head. "No." As the helicopter lifted off, the vast expanse of ice stretched out below them, endless and pristine. But Morgan knew the truth. The ice was no longer a prison. The system, the creature, was awake, and they had brought a piece of it with them. He stared out the window, his hand clenched into a fist. He thought of Mark's warning, her desperate plea in the final log. "If you find this, don't..." Morgan's jaw tightened. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. The cold depths of Antarctica weren't finished with them. Not yet. The end was not a resolution. It was only the beginning.